Okay, here we go. Welcome to the Disability Squeeze, where we uncover the hidden costs of living with a disability and explore practical solutions to make life more affordable and equitable for everyone. I'm Dr. Zach Morris, an associate professor at Stony Brook, and today, in our inaugural episode, we'll be talking with my esteemed colleague, Dr. Ariel Silverman, about the Disability Squeeze and its impact for people who are blind or have low vision. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Ariel Silverman, Director of Research at the American Foundation for the Blind. Ariel is a very accomplished researcher who holds a PhD in social psychology, has authored numerous studies related to blindness and visual impairment, and is also the author of an amazing memoir called Just Human: The Quest for Disability Wisdom, Respect, and Inclusion, which is a total must-read that I think combines really big ideas for social change with real wisdom and humor. My first question for you, Ariel, welcome.
Thank you so much.
First question for you is, what does the disability squeeze mean to you, and why is it important to highlight these mostly hidden costs?
So, the disability squeeze basically is looking at the consequences of having extra costs associated with disability. And we call it a squeeze because, on one hand, people with disabilities have historically and currently have had limited earning potential for a variety of reasons. There is a lot of discrimination in the workplace, even though disability rights laws in many countries protect the rights of people with disabilities. There is still a lot of discrimination. There are also a lot of barriers to people with disabilities getting higher education and training related to limited accessibility of learning materials in a lot of fields. There are a lot of workplace technologies that are not fully accessible. And so, for all of these and other reasons, people with disabilities have faced high rates of unemployment, underemployment, or even non-participation in the workforce. As a consequence, many people with disabilities are on fixed incomes or limited incomes. So if you think about, on one hand, there's less money coming in. And then on the other hand, there's more money going out because people with disabilities have to pay for a lot of things out of pocket that are directly related to their disability. And benefits programs do not always fully ameliorate of those extra expenses. So a lot of healthcare expenses might not be covered by health insurance or even public health benefits, things like medications, procedures, copays, all those kinds of things that people with disabilities need related to their disability, they have to pay for out of pocket. Also, assistive technologies, like in the case of blindness, braille display technologies can cost thousands of dollars and are often purchased out of pocket. So you have less money coming in and then you have more money going out. So as a result, there is very limited discretionary income or income that's left over. And as a result, as we found in our research, many people with disabilities find themselves having to choose between, say, buying medication or buying food or paying rent, or buying, any sort of optional thing that they might want to improve their standard of living. So people are reporting higher rates of unmet needs. There's things they need that they can't get because they can't afford those things. And then it kind of loops around because when people can't afford things that they need, they're less able to participate in employment and other income earning activities.
Right. Yeah. So really feeling the pinch and in this stuck position because of the need to purchase these disability related expenses and the burden that places. I have a question because in your memoir you discuss how the disability community often encounters can't statements. You just have a can't statement, right? Can't afford, can't.
Right.
You know, which you say are limitations perceived as inherent to their disability rather than the consequences of systemic design flaws. So I'm wondering if you could elaborate on how this perspective, this idea of, encountering these can't statements ties into this concept of the disability squeeze.
Well, I talked about employment discrimination and negative attitudes that employers have about people with disabilities that directly limit the income potential that people with disabilities have to be able to buy things that they need. A lot of those discriminatory attitudes come from can't kinds of beliefs. So employers might believe that somebody who is blind, for example, there's no way that person could do advanced mathematics, or be an engineer or be a statistician. And that often comes from a place of ignorance. People make these assumptions that kind of come from, oh, well, I use my sight to do those tasks. So if somebody doesn't have sight, therefore they can't do those things. I talked about in the book how over time we have seen things that people with disabilities couldn't do become things that people with disabilities could do thanks to innovations like Braille. Was invented by Louis Braille, by a blind French teenager in 1829, or I'm sorry, 1824. And prior to the invention of Braille, blind people really couldn't read and write in any sort of competitive way, in any sort of way that was comparable to how seeing people could read and write. Um, so saying a blind person couldn't read or write was an accurate statement prior to the adoption of Braille. But after Braille was adopted, and now that we have assistive technology for either auditory or tactile access to information, it's no longer true that blind people can't read and write. We still say that blind people can't drive, and that's a true statement, but that has more to do with how motor vehicles operate than it has to do with how blind people operate. Right now, the way that motor vehicles operate requires a lot of human interaction based on being able to process multiple types of information that come in through the windows of a car. So right now, the best solution that we have to be able to operate motor vehicles is through human vision, to be able to perceive all the information that we need to perceive. But as many people know, there are innovations that are being developed related to autonomous vehicles, related to assisted driving systems, so that either the car does the work or the human has other sources of information that they can use to operate the vehicle or a combination of the two. So there will come a day when somebody will say blind people can't drive, and that will not be a true statement. I think the way this feeds back to the disability squeeze, not only is that these can'ts unfairly limit people's earning potential, but that some of the can'ts also lead to more disability related costs. So the fact that we can't drive means that we have to pay out of pocket for transportation services or grocery delivery services that may exceed the cost of owning and maintaining a car. If we come up with technological innovations that make independent transportation more feasible, then the costs of transportation, accessible transportation for people with disabilities should go down. Of course, the catch to that is that we want to be sure that the assistive technologies themselves do not become prohibitively expensive.
I just want to get back to this point about assistive tech and the squeeze and in these costs as a financial barrier, right? Imposing a can't, right? I think we talk a lot about the lived environment and the inaccessibility of the environment, right? Whether that be lack of elevators in subways, right? For people with disabilities,
Right.
with mobility issues, or lack of sighted assistance in pedestrians in New York City, right? For people who are blind or have low vision. And because there's so many incredible technologies that enable people to do things that they couldn't do so long ago, the financial burden of accessing those is also, I think, a kind of barrier, just like those others, right? That to not be able to afford things that you could use to do things imposes a burden and a barrier on social participation. You shared an experience from your college years when using paratransit for a typically 25-minute commute, which took you 2 hours in your book. Right? And
At least, yeah. Sometimes it took 4.
yeah. So I'm wondering, how does talking about the lived environment, how does inadequate accessible transportation infrastructure impose financial and time burdens on people with disabilities, and what improvements are necessary?
Well, people have to make trade-offs basically between cost and time, between financial cost and time cost. So there are transportation services like public transit, which benefits people without disabilities as well. There's also paratransit, which is specially designed vehicles for people with disabilities to be able to travel door to door. And those services are very low cost. They're not usually free, but they're very, very low cost. But the trade-off is that those services, depending on how good the infrastructure is in the particular area. Like if you think about a place like New York City or Washington, D.C., the public transit is not perfect, but it's definitely has, a relatively timely, you can get places in a relatively timely way if they are on the fixed route transit route. There are other places where public transit is very slim or even non-existent, and paratransit often the way that it is set up, it is a shared ride service, and there may not be enough drivers to meet the demand from passengers. And so what happens is that passengers end up, and what happened to me that I wrote about in the book where I was an 18-year-old summer intern traveling to my workplace, um, is that I sometimes would be on the vehicle for hours while they picked up and dropped off other passengers because there just were too many people for one driver, basically. And there are other issues. Sometimes just the routing isn't very efficient, but the main issue is likely just demand is exceeding supply. Um, so I was sitting on this vehicle for hours and hours, and sometimes I would be late for my internship, or I had to get up, extremely early if I wanted to be sure that I was on time. And luckily, because I was just an intern, it was okay for me to be late as long as I notified people ahead of time. But in a regular job, that's often not acceptable. I often didn't get home. I think my job ended at 3 or 3:30, and I often didn't get home until dinner time, 5:30, 6 o'clock, because I was riding around on these vans. So that's on one end is you have low cost, but also not timely forms of transportation. Sometimes with fixed route, it's the same way where you have to take multiple buses. So you have to wait for connections. Buses might be late um, because you're sharing the ride with a whole bunch of people. Then on the other end, you have transportation options that are private, that are door to door and point to point, where you're not picking up anybody else, you're not sharing the service with anybody else, like, Lyft and Uber. We call those things ride share, but it's usually not really share. It's just somebody's picking you up and dropping you off. So those are great. I mean, I use those all the time because they're reliable. They tell you exactly when you're going to get there. You can schedule it ahead of time. You know you're going to get there on time. But the downside, of course, is the cost. So something like a doctor's appointment that I had yesterday, where I took Uber both ways, cost me round trip about $45. And for me as a working professional, that's not really problematic. It would be problematic if I had to take that every single day to and from, $45 a day. That would start to get a little problematic because that's like $900 a month out of my salary. Um, but for, occasional doctor's appointments, not a big deal. But somebody who's on a fixed income or who's working part-time, hourly, something like that, those kinds of costs could be very problematic and they could start to cut into the income that they need to be able to buy other things. So basically, you have these trade-offs between cost and efficiency, time efficiency, whereas people who drive their own vehicles can often achieve after they've paid off, and we know that cars are also very expensive. But after the car is paid off, the expenses go down, and people can achieve both efficient transportation and low-cost transportation without disabilities.
Yeah, so transportation, an enormous expense. And you imagine for a lot of people who need to get to work, it's not really an option, right? And if
Right.
4 hour, 2 to 4 hour paratransit commute is not really a workable option. And so they just have to stomach those costs, making it really diving into their budgets. In your book, you presented a really interesting typology of inclusion, where you talk about, you end the book with this stages of inclusion, which begins from the first stage of outright animosity towards disability to what you call the fifth stage, which is really full community integration. My question for you is, what would a society striving for complete inclusion look like concerning the challenges outlined in the disability squeeze?
That's a great question. I think what immediately comes to mind is that we want these disability related costs to be shared by the entire society. So there aren't some people who have disabilities who are expected to pay and then others without disabilities who are not. So, I mean, that probably sounds like better public benefits. Um, I definitely think we need to eliminate the assets limits that people who are receiving Social Security, supplemental security income, and Medicaid, those types of benefits, are currently being subjected to these extremely stringent asset limits, um, that literally just prevent them from saving any money, from being able to earn above a certain amount, and keep them in basically perpetual disability squeeze, perpetually low income and high cost, because those programs do not pay for a lot of out-of-pocket expenses related to disability. So I would want to see those programs reformed so that asset limits are removed and so that and earnings limits are adjusted, and so that these programs actually do pay for disability related expenses. You know, at least the more obvious ones, like paying for medical care that's directly related to a disability, paying for assistive technology, things like that. Also, the vocational rehabilitation agencies that purchase assistive technology for students and people who are seeking employment, oftentimes they create a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of restrictions on the freedoms and autonomy of people who receive the assistive technology. So they often have to, for example, commit to a specific vocational goal. And we all know that college students, they change, their interests change, they discover new things that they want to study or that they want to do, and their vocational goals change, and they should be permitted to let those vocational goals change. They should not have to get approval from a vocational counselor for the vocational goal that they want. Oftentimes, there's also long waits for assistive technology. So there's just a lot of reforms that need to happen so that people can have the assistive technology they need, and so they can have the medical care that they need, so that they're able to seek education and employment that will enable them to increase their earning potential. It's understood that the asset limits and a lot of the limits are there because there's an idea that we shouldn't have too many people receiving benefits. That we should only give benefits to people who qualify and who meet these stringent requirements. But if we give people what they need, then they have the potential to remove themselves from the disability roles and be able to earn higher incomes.
Mhm.
There are always going to be some people who may not be able to hold traditional employment or may not be able to work enough hours to have an income that enables them to pay their rent and things like that. There's going to be some people who will always need public assistance. But if we can meet some of those other needs, they might not need as much assistance. They might be able to pay some of it back in taxes. Um, and, thinking even more radically, I think we should make reforms so that everybody has a basic income, so that employment and being able to meet basic needs are not inextricably tied to each other. Everybody has something that they can do to make a contribution. It may or may not meet the standard for, full-time competitive integrated employment, but a lot of people can make contributions in ways that others may not be able to pay for, artistic contributions, for example. But people who contribute to the world through making good art, making good music, should also be able to eat, be able to pay their rent.
On the basic income idea, it's kind of interesting. Is that when we published a previous paper that I published estimating how much it costs to live with a disability in the U.S. and saying it's about, people with disabilities require 29% more income to have the same standard of living as people without disabilities because of their disability related expenses. There was a really interesting academic debate on Twitter, what used to be, we'll call it Twitter because it was not X, it was the pre early days of Twitter, where it was really interesting dialogue happening on that platform, in my opinion. There was a really interesting conversation about how disability related costs make a basic income guarantee a challenge to administer, because you can't, basically it's saying, that if we were to give everyone the same amount in the basic income, it would be unfair to people with disabilities because that same income would not lead to the same standard of living or the same utility, because people with disabilities have to spend some of that money on their disability related expenses, right? And so a basic income guarantee would need to, compensate and adjust for disability related expenses in order to be equal for everybody. And I'm wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean that it does get very tricky because even within the disability world, different people have different levels of disability related need and disability related costs. So that 29% is just an average. There will be some people whose disability related expenses will be much higher, others whose disability related expenses will be very minimal. Um, and so it is difficult to know exactly how to administer that. I mean, my first thought would be allowing, you know, if there were a basic income, allowing additional expenses to be covered or reimbursed beyond the basic income level up to a certain amount so that people could submit claims for reimbursement if they purchase assistive tech or if they receive healthcare services, those kinds of things. And that just puts some administrative burden onto the individuals. But that might be a way to personalize the amount of compensatory income that people receive.
Well, I wonder, I mean, it might not be so unprecedented to develop a system like that. I mean, we have, for example, lists of categories that are eligible or considered disability related expenses as part of the ABLE Act, for example, right? There's a list
Right,
administrators use and say these are exempt from SSI asset, or restrictions. You can spend money on these things, and these are disability related. So you can almost see that as a template for doing something like that where you compensate. But I mean, I think one of the larger questions for basic income people too is, are you replacing the entire social welfare system, the welfare state as is, with your basic income, or are you adding a basic income guarantee on top of the existing social welfare infrastructure?
right, right. And there could certainly be pros and cons to both solutions. It seems like if you added basic income on top of what already exists, then people with disabilities would get kind of an extra SSI amount on top of the basic income. And then if everybody had basic income, would that eliminate everybody would have a certain level of assets, so the asset limits would no longer be relevant for receiving disability related benefits. Um, so that would fundamentally change certain aspects of the welfare system. People who qualified previously would no longer qualify unless the criteria were changed. But maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that means that there would be less people below the poverty line.
Certainly, right? If everyone
Yeah,
had these, right, we saw that with the child tax credit expansion, right? Overnight, 1 million more children, I think, or some amount, were no longer poor, right? Because of
right.
the tax credit, which I think the closest we've come to a kind of basic income at a federal level in recent years. And I think to everyone's surprise politically, that did not lead to one of the big ideas in political science is that when you create a social welfare system or social welfare program, a benefit program, you create a political constituency of people who benefit from that benefit, who are going to be very vocal and very adamant to keep it, and who are going to be, a concentrated interest group who are going to oppose cutting of that program. And we just didn't see that with the child tax credit, right? We just didn't see, that it was able to be, that it did not continue. And I guess we're getting into the weeds of basic income now and veering off from the disability squeeze. But I guess let me tie it back in, which is, what would it take for us to get to a political space where we could see meaningful change on this?
Well, I think we need to figure out how to make it a bipartisan issue. And I think we can make it a bipartisan issue because I think, for conservatives who are interested in, who are concerned about economic success and, giving people a chance to participate in the economy and be employed, we need to do more research on this, but it seems like mitigating some of the disability related costs could boost employment potential because people will be able to have the healthcare and the technology and the resources that they need to seek employment or to maintain employment. So I think from both a kind of equality and rights focused perspective and from an economic perspective, it makes sense to care about the disability squeeze.
Thank you so much. So I think we should wrap up. And one thing we're doing with this website and this podcast is we want to encourage people to share their stories of the disability squeeze. And so could you just tell to whoever's listening, why it's important to bring these stories to light and share their experiences?
Well, I think the disability squeeze could be a pretty abstract concept without stories of people who've actually experienced it and how it's affected them. There has been dialogue already about the term disability tax, and basically the disability tax involves just the disability related expenses. And that's important, but I think the disability squeeze goes one step further because it looks at how those expenses affect people's lives. So when people have to pay the disability tax, what happens next? And we found in the survey that people reported that they had trouble paying for things they needed, like food and rent, that they experienced a lot of anxiety about making ends meet, or that they went into debt, for example, to be able to finance things they needed related to their disability. So we know there are these consequences. We also know that people are going without certain things they need because of the expense and because of the lack of income. So the disability squeeze shows us why it's important to care about the disability taxes and, gives us some ideas about how to fix the problem.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ariel Silverman. I encourage everyone to read her amazing book, Just Human: The Quest for Disability Wisdom, Respect, and Inclusion. And I really appreciate having you here on this inaugural little experiment we're doing with this podcast. So thank you so much, Ariel.